This e-lecture draws from Chapter 13 in your textbook, Agency, Group, and Organizational Practice. This is more of the meso-macro level of solution-focused therapy. I realize for some of you, as you've been going through this course, maybe in the back of your mind you have thoughts like, well, I'm not going to be a clinical counselor. I don't want to do clinical therapy. I really want to do more macro level social work, or I want to stay in the meso world of social work, and so this doesn't apply to me. Be encouraged, and hopefully I've encouraged you earlier on in the semester versus here where we're at the end of the semester, that these skills that you've learned, while yes, it's true, you may not pull out the miracle question, or you may not pull out certain skills in other settings, but there are so many foundational skills you have learned that can even apply when it comes to agency, group, and organizational work. And this chapter is going to dive into how those techniques that you've learned throughout the semester that maybe you thought were only specific to working with individuals now can be applied even in other elements. So if you're not a clinical person, if that's not where you see your future, still see how this integrates into that macro and meso level work, because it is very fascinating to see the outcomes that have resulted from some of the research that was done. So let's get started. Case documentation and problem-focused settings. I think probably one of the least liked areas of social work have to be the fact that we document and that we must document. It's actually one of the strongest points of advocacy is written advocacy, and that includes what we write, because long after we've left our agencies, what we write stays behind and can often be used in court and in other settings. So it's a very important part of social work, but so many social workers, and it's personally not one of my favorite parts of social work, is having to deal with the documentation. But even more so is it complicated if you are a solution-focused practitioner and your documentation that's required by your agency follows more closely to the problem-solving model, where you have the initial assessment, the treatment or service plan that is fixed very early on in service and doesn't necessarily feel as fluid for change, progress notes, and the closing summary. So sometimes agencies will have a very stringent documentation rule on what needs to be collected, and oftentimes that may not include a lot of solution-focused elements. So how do you follow the agency protocol while also remaining solution-oriented, since we know that it does work? It's been proven to work. And I have seen the difference when I come from a solution-focused standpoint with my clients as opposed to when I don't. In the text, I had a great example of how Peter navigated the system, where though he had to ask certain questions, he was able to prepare clients. And so in that very initial assessment, when usually he would be understanding the problem, but then also trying to understand what client wants instead, and some of the goals and solution pieces that he's starting to weed out earlier on, instead he would let the client know our agency has certain protocols that we have to complete, and we're required to complete certain documentation. And so I realized some of these questions might be personal, and some of them might ask a lot about certain circumstances. I'm interested in knowing what some of your goals are, and we're going to be able to move into that process interspersed while we're doing this documentation, but when we're done with the documentation, even more so we can move into that direction. And I know when I worked with clients, when I worked with adults specifically, and there were so many very personal questions that I had to ask them that very first meeting, I would say something similar to them in the fact of, I realized that I'm asking a lot of really personal questions, and you just met me, and I realize it takes a lot for me to ask you to disclose so much so early on in our time together. And so if there's something that I ask you that is too personal or that you'd rather not share at this point in time, please just let me know, and then we can move on from there and come back to that later. And oftentimes my clients are very grateful for that, and most of the time they would actually share pretty freely, but I gave them the empowerment and the knowledge that just because I asked doesn't mean that you have to answer me, because I realize that I'm asking you some things that are pretty tough to answer. So that's one way of being able to set it up for your clients, as well as you're asking those questions, interspersing some more competency-based, strengths-based type questions, so you're not just asking problem questions for 45 minutes straight, but instead you're using some of those solution-focused skills to balance off what you're asking so that it includes some of the positive solution-focused, goal-oriented type questions. So some of those competency-based questions, here are some examples. Now these are used during your interview to highlight the strengths, successes, and abilities that the client has had to cope. And so they may not be part of the agency protocol, but as a solution-focused therapist, you can pull from this so that you can use it properly. So here's one. You tell me your mother was addicted to alcohol and your father was a drug addict. So how did you manage not to use drugs or alcohol? Now notice that this may have been a question that would be posed after you've asked family history on substance abuse. And then you've asked the person's individual history of substance abuse and been able to compare that, wow, that's really impressive. It's sometimes it's so difficult when you have family substance abuse for someone to maybe make decisions that are a bit different. And so what was it for you that has resulted in your decisions to be different from that of your parents? Here's another one. You tell me that there was domestic violence in your home as you were growing up. How were you able to cope with this so that you still did well in school? So again, we're pulling from some of the problem-oriented history type stuff that we might need to gather anyway, and we're drawing from it and being able to pull out those strengths and hear from our clients what they've done and how that's different from their past. Another one, you mentioned that many of your siblings have become involved in gangs. What have you done to handle this and remain out of the gang scene in spite of those pressures that are probably existent? And so, again, exploring, not just dwelling on all the problems in the client's life, but being able to connect those positive strengths that you're starting to see at the early onset of your assessment. So these are some examples of competency-based questions. Do understand what it means to have a competency-based question and what the question may look like. These are 3 examples, but there are many, many, many other ways that you can ask that question. Just be aware of what that means and be able to know how to be able to ask that. Case conferences. This is when you get together with your colleagues and you might share a case that you're working with that maybe, most likely it's usually what that you're having challenges with. In a problem-focused setting, you usually describe the problem and history in detail. This doesn't necessarily align with solution focus because, again, we don't just dredge up only the problems and all of the detailed, sorted past, but we really want to use that as a stepping stone to really understand the solutions and goals that we want to get to. So as a solution-focused practitioner in that setting, it may be more helpful for us to listen for what the colleague wants different with the case. So what are they wanting instead? What has been helpful so far? What has the colleague done to make that happen? What would the client say the practitioner has done that has been useful, and affirm the difficulty of the case situation? Do you see some differences here in the questions you would ask your coworker to what you would ask your client? As you can see, these questions are very similar, and that just boils down to the fact that solution-focused therapy techniques and that paradigm shift truly is a paradigm mental shift. So even if you're in a case conferencing setting with your colleagues, you can still come at it from the angle of solution-focused and ask those questions that would help to pull out the strengths and the goals and solutions that might be present. So in a solution-focused setting, the case conference might look different, where the main focus is for practitioners to troubleshoot, but also to learn more thoroughly what to do further to improve solution building. It might have more of a mix of expertise in the room, as well as an ability for individuals to learn and look towards that future-oriented, solution-focused type of questioning. When it comes to supervision, and I realize some of you might be saying, I can't believe you made us read this chapter. Right now we're currently students. I'm not going to be supervising anybody clinically anytime soon, or I'm not going to be a supervisor from what you know, but I want to warn you that you never know how quickly you might become an administrator within the social work setting. So all too often, individuals graduate with their BSW and they might start working, or maybe they get their MSW right after and then they get a job, and they find themselves in a supervisory role very early on. Don't be surprised if that may be your situation. And so I want you to have this context, because in a few years you might very well be a supervisor. And so if you are, this is helpful for you to know of how you can still remain solution-oriented when you're supervising your coworkers. So until proven otherwise, we always assume that those that we supervise, whether these are those that work for us or that we might that might be seeking clinical supervision from us, but we assume that they want to feel that their work makes a difference in someone's life. They want to learn those skills needed to achieve this motivation and commitment. They want to be accepted and valued by the organization they work in. They want to identify with the organization's mission and objectives, and they already possess problem-solving skills to some degree. Thus, the task of supervision is more to add and increase the solution-building skills. And when they feel respected and supported by their organization and superiors, they will also in turn be respectful to their clients. And so these are the things that we will assume of those we supervise until we receive further notice or something that contradicts this. So some sample supervision questions. What would your client say about how helpful or useful the sessions have been for him or her so far? On a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the most useful he or she had hoped for and 1 is the opposite, what number would your client give to your work with him or her so far? Suppose a client were to think your usefulness to him or her improved by 1 point. What might she or he notice you are doing differently? Again, do these questions sound similar to what you've been learning all this semester? They do. They are still the same format, same typing of question. We are just still pulling those type of questions and then inputting them to a different scenario that still makes it a helpful tool to use. And last one is, how would you find that out, and what else do you do to learn? Your textbook has several other examples that are there that I encourage you to make sure that you review and you understand how you can use those very same questions outside of that clinical one-on-one setting, but you can even use it when you're working with coworkers. You could even use it even though you might be working in a setting that's not social work. Why can't you use some of these skills in that work setting that you currently may be in? I think you will find that it will be beneficial to the way you communicate and collaborate with your superiors as well as your colleagues when it comes to working together. So, speaking of working together, relationships with colleagues in problem-focused settings. So let's say you have this solution-focused paradigm, but then all of your colleagues, or most of them, subscribe to more of a problem-focused paradigm. Don't directly challenge their colleagues' frame of reference, just like we don't challenge our clients' frame of reference. We want to show that respectful posture towards them and take that posture of not knowing. So we're still exploring more about what they think and then exploring maybe what their apprehension or concerns may be about the solution-focused model. Pay attention to what they may want from your interaction. So see, what is it that they're seeking? Are they wanting to really understand? Are they wanting to have more clarity? Are they wanting to just challenge and throw doubt? But tune into what that looks like, and then institute agency discussion. If it's possible, how great would it be to have maybe a lunch brown bag meeting, or maybe some kind of get together after work, or maybe at a case conference, being able to have a few minutes of the time to discuss the different paradigms that the individuals at work there may operate from. And just remember, no matter what you do, that you engage in open and respectful dialogue. The same type of respect we give our clients and the openness is the same type of character and respect and openness we should give our colleagues. And sometimes in the social work profession, unfortunately, I see that individuals might be very kind and caring to their clients, but they may be very rude and harsh towards their coworkers. And so we want to transfer the same type of skills and respect, not just to one subgroup, but to really all that we come in contact with, both our colleagues, our superiors, those that we work with outside in other agencies, and of course our clients. In relationship with collaterals. Now, collaterals are defined as professionals at other agencies who basically are connected to your client in some way. Maybe it's because they referred them to you. Maybe it's because you're working with them at the same time. So they're working with them on a certain issue, you're working with them on something else. But for whatever reasons, they are connected to that client. They're another professional entity, and they are interested in the outcome of your work. So this is what we mean by collaterals. Assume that they are also competent and deserve respect. Whether it's a probation officer, or maybe it's another caseworker that's dealing with them, or another type of professional that's dealing with the family or the individual. Use those skills that you learn to discover what they may want from you as well, and then find out what they've done that they feel was useful to the client. And as always, we affirm the valuable work that they have done. This is a positive way of being able to remain in communication, and networking and having support from others is priceless when it comes to this field, because if you try to only just leave it between you and your client, you're going to find yourself with a lot of gaps of information. And so the more you can engage with your collaterals, the more that you can invest in conversations with your colleagues and your superiors, the more of a well-rounded professional you will become. Up to this point, you have seen how solution-focused skills can also transfer not just with your work with individuals, but also when it comes to documentation and case conferencing and supervision and working with collaterals and colleagues and in an agency context. And so these types of things that you have learned in this course also transfer when you look into group work. Later on down the line, you'll be taking Practice 2, which will help you learn more skills to facilitate group work and keep in mind these solution building techniques that you've learned in this course, because you can use those same things within a group context. In the same token, you can also use it in organizational practice, where how you structure your organization and how you allow the communication and flow to occur can be with a solution building paradigm versus problem solving. And so the 3 websites that you see here, you're welcome to visit them on your time, but they are entities that have espoused the solution building procedures within their organization. And so it's a neat thing to see how it just can be applied not only for micro level social work with individuals, but also meso and macro level. All of these things, whether you're dealing with individuals, dyads, families, groups, colleagues, collateral, supervision, or even organizations and communities, you can integrate solution-focused techniques into those diverse settings. And that's how versatile everything you've been learning this semester is. And so I hope you have found value in it. I hope you have been able to understand the context, because that's important to know the foundation, but you've also developed those skills and value sets that you would need to truly be able to integrate this wonderful technique. And so that's all for now, and if this is most likely probably the last lecture that you're going to listen to for this textbook, since this is the last chapter that we will be assigned. And I just hope that you are encouraged and continue practicing your skills. This is a lifelong journey, that you continuously develop your skill sets, and your bag of tools continues to get big, to get larger and larger as you continue refining your skills. And so keep up the practice. Practice makes permanent. Thanks for staying by.